Well, welcome back everyone to Generations and Implicit Bias. Well, in this next section, we're going to be talking more about implicit bias, okay? So I'd imagine that's not the first time you've heard those words together. I'd imagine you might have even taken a class or a course or gone through a presentation or made to sit through training on implicit bias. My hope is in this section that we just get real. And just tell it for what it is and what it isn't, and hopefully some of this stuff that we review will really stick. So the first thing to consider is this concept of reality and perception, right? And you've all heard the phrase reality is perception. Actually, psychologists would tell you that is incorrect. Reality is actually reality. Perception is the perception you have on reality, right? So you see reality in the way that you see it, which is going to be different than the way someone else sees it. Anais Nin was a journalist and a writer in the 1930s and 1940s, and she had a great quote. It's, "We don't see the world as it is. We see it as we are," right? So we're kind of looking at the world through our own lenses as opposed to someone else who's had different experiences that looks at the world through their own lenses. Case in point, you may have seen this this type of thing before. This is an image of, well, you tell me, what do you see? So the reality is there are two images here. Now, the first thing that I see are a profile of two faces looking at each other that are, I think there looks like they're identical. But then when I look at it and I look at it and look at it, I realize, oh, it's a pedestal actually. It's not the phases, it's a pedestal. Well, which is it? Well, the reality is that it's both. The perception is that you see one or the other, or maybe the perception is that you do see both. So is it Wolverine, or is it two Batmen that are facing each other, very thin Batmen that are actually facing each other? I didn't see the Batman in Batman's until they told me that's what it was actually. But again, an example of perception and reality. So right into the definition of implicit bias, the components of implicit bias. What are the kind of building blocks? Well, number one building block is it's a perception we have about other people. Again, not reality, but it's a perception we have about other people. That's number one. Number two is it's based on influences of past experiences. Now, we talked a little bit about generations and how you come into your own generation based on your lived experience. Well, implicit bias is the same thing. It's based on the influences of your past experiences. Number three, implicit bias is conclusions that you reach about groups or ethnicities or tribes or whatever, or professions, right? You've reached a conclusion, about that. And the fourth thing, which is really important for you to remember, if you don't already know, is implicit bias is unconscious. Unconscious is just another word for implicit, right? And frankly, that makes it a little more palatable, right? No one wants to be biased, right? Well, the reality is that, well, I mean, some people do want to be biased, I suppose, but most people generally don't. But the reality is that many people are because they don't realize they are, right? And the only way to actually extract yourself out of that unconsciousness about your bias is actually to be more aware of that you are, right? Sounds confusing. We'll get to this in more depth a little bit later. So implicit bias, how? Well, how does it happen in the brain? Well, it's actually triggered automatically through what is scientists call rapid association of people and our attitudes and stereotypes about other people. And oftentimes it runs contrary to our stated beliefs and attitudes, right? We could say we believe in this concept of equity, and we might actually really believe it, but then we behave in a way, actually our activity demonstrates that we're actually biased based on our discrimination. That's kind of the difference between intent and action in that sense. When people act based on prejudice and stereotypes without intending to do so, that is implicit bias. Also important to note that people can act based on their biases adopted in their culture, right? Even regions of the country have different cultures. You know, parts around the world have different cultures, and those cultures oftentimes lead to just bias, implicit bias. So a lot of folks wonder about this difference between bias and a stereotype, and you kind of think of it this way: a bias is a personal preference, like or dislike, that interferes with the ability to be impartial, unprejudiced, or objective. A stereotype is a preconceived idea that attributes certain characteristics in general to all members of a class set. Now, what does that all mean? Well, as an example, if you think that all Asian people are smart, right, you may actually think that explicitly, or you may have an implicit bias about that, but there's just, you know, this assumption that all Asians are smart, or that white men can't dance, right? Those are kind of broad perception around ethnicities or groups, and that's just a stereotype. So that just kind of sits over here as a stereotype. But if you end up hiring an Asian for a job that also has an equally qualified Black applicant because you think Blacks are not as smart as Asians, then you're biased. So the difference is the stereotype is kind of just out there, and it's kind of this preconceived thing, and then a bias is taking action on that stereotype. So bias is more damaging than a stereotype, right? Stereotypes happen, right? They're everywhere. They just happen. And some are true and some are not true, okay? But a bias is a little more insidious. A bias is like acting on that stereotype. One of the things about bias is that it's subtle. You know, it's not overt, but it still has an impact. So implicit bias, it impacts how we view the world and those around us, right? Everything we do impacts other people. We live in a you know, our world is a system. We can't really do anything without affecting the people that are around us, right? And especially leaders, and you do notice this, you know, what leaders say, how they say it, when they say it, their body language, people pay attention to leaders, right? It's just natural. And so if a leader is showing up either explicitly or implicitly with bias, that's going to have huge impacts on the behavior that people have around that leader. And that has to do really with this notion of power, and there's a real strong relationship actually with power and implicit bias that I want to just kind of point out here. So simple chart here that basically demonstrates that the more power you have, the more influence you can have that is negative on others if you're practicing implicit bias, okay? Because if you are in a position of power and you are making policy, for example, if you're in charge of policy for a division or a department, if your memos that you send are read by more people, right? That's just going to have, you know, if you have implicit bias or bias of any kind, that's going to have a more negative effect. Now, this is important. This is the flip side of that. If you have power, but you actually effectively limit your implicit bias, you actually have a positive effect on others, okay? So it doesn't just work one way, right? Just because you have power doesn't mean you're bad. It just means you have more influence. So to the extent that you actually do exhibit implicit bias or bias of any kind, you're going to have a negative effect. To the extent that you do not, you'll have a positive effect. So why do human beings have implicit bias? So it's a flaw, but why do human beings have it? Well, you have to go back a ways, really, to kind of humanoid psychology, long ago in the caveman days here, right? Well, tribes, existing nomadic tribes, over time became cultures, and cultures needed to perpetuate and survive. And over time, cultures created their own narrative and their own biases around the fears that they had, around the needs that they had, and around the interests that they have, right? And so, um, so there were some legitimate kind of survival reasons way back in the day, right, that were important to the perpetuation of human beings. But here's the deal: we've been pretty civilized, I would say, for the past couple hundred years. And so there's no, it's like a vestigial organ. We don't need bias anymore, implicit bias. It doesn't really serve a good function right now. It's kind of like the appendix, right, of psychology. It doesn't really serve a good purpose, but that was the origins and kind of how it came to be. So if you look back in, if you look back in the day to the caveman days and stuff, um, this is you've probably seen this iceberg analogy before, and back in the day, when human beings were unsophisticated, they just kind of paid attention to the stuff at the top. It's like what's your age, gender, behavior, physical characteristics, and even today, we tend to have first impressions around these things at the top of the pyramid. The reality is that people are much more complex than that, right? I mean, all those invisible things or less visible things about a human being tell much more about that human than even the stuff on the top. The interesting thing about generations is that it exists both above and below the iceberg. But think about it. I mean, if you really don't know the life experience of someone you're encountering, social skills and family traditions, and personal beliefs and their attitudes and their worldviews and their thought patterns, and you just know the stuff at the top, you may be missing a lot. But people are complicated, right? That's part of what this iceberg shows, is that people are very complicated. And it is important, particularly if you're in a position of power, to understand that there's a lot more to a human being than meets the eye, than kind of what you see. So all that stuff below the pyramid and all that stuff above the pyramid makes the person that you are, right? And you develop values as an individual based on the person that you are, right? You have your own personal values. I like to think of values as like your core. It's stuff you won't compromise on. It's like really what's important to you. It really defines you as a person at the end of the day. And values tend to be they start early and they stay with you for the rest of your life, typically, and the average person. What's interesting about values is they also exist in groups of people. So a company or an organization, right? Fairfax County, working for the federal government, working for Google, they have their own values. It's called shared values or culture, right? The definition of culture is shared values. And so they have their own values that really kind of define who they are. Then there are generational values. So remember, we talked about the boomers and the Xers and the millennials and the Gen Z. They all have their own perspective and way of looking at things. And oftentimes, those values, embedded in those values, are implicit biases. We're going to be talking a little bit about how generations are perceived with their values and how that kind of relates to implicit bias. But just to give you a real quick kind of like example of values and generations, I'm just going to focus on the workplace for a couple minutes here. So we have our four generations. We got Dave over there on the far left, and then we have Jennifer, and then Josh and Samantha, right? Samantha. So Dave, who's basically had 4 jobs in 40 years, is what you might call a traditionalist, a boomer. Boomers tend to value work. They are into work, work, and work. Boomers are the generation that kind of invented, I was going to say alcoholism, but that's been going on for a long time. Boomers actually invented workaholism. Before the boomers, the silent generation used punch cards, right? They punch in, clock, punch out, right? Very simple. You start on time, you end on time. Boomers said, the heck with that. We're going to come in early and stay late and work, right? So that's a value that they tend to have, for example, in the workplace. Now, Jennifer over here, Jennifer is, she's okay with work. She likes work, right? As a Gen Xer, but she actually prefers this notion of work-life balance because Jennifer wants to get back and see her daughter's soccer game, or has a conference with the teacher, and will really work on developing her children, and so home is just as much as important as work, and they balance it out. And Jennifer may have a bias against Dave because she's like, why do you work so much? What are you actually accomplishing with all that, right? I mean, Xers are known for their brutal efficiency at kind of everything they do, which is kind of cool, I have to say, as an Xer. They just cut right to it, right? So Jennifer's walking around with a bias. In the meantime, Dave's looking at Jennifer saying, you're such a hard ass. I mean, you just try to move so quick to it. You've got to like, get into understanding the whole thing, right? Boomers are into the whole thing. All right. So those are those two over there, and they prefer a more hands-off approach to management. So when it comes to management, when they were young, they didn't want a bunch of management around them, right? They just like, get away from me. I'll figure this out. And so when the young people come along, they expect the young people to not want management either, but that's actually not the case. As you look at Josh and as you look at Samantha up here, they in fact actually have different values, and they in fact like hands-on, would actually rather be hands-on. Now that doesn't mean micromanaged, but they tend to like managers that are very specific about, what are the things you want me to accomplish? Let's track my progress. Let's kind of go through this kind of one thing at a time. So Josh up there, the millennial, he is, he's all actually about work-life integration. So what's work-life integration? Work-life integration is actually taking purpose and the things that are important to you and making sure that you work in a job that crosses over to what your purpose is, right? With Dave and with Jennifer, it was all about I just need to get a job, right? It's all about just working. With Dave, work is life. With Jennifer, work is like a gig, okay? I think with Josh and millennials, work is something to get meaning out of, or they'd like to get meaning out of their work, right? And so they are more likely to integrate their work. And actually, it's a generation that takes work very seriously in the workplace. And people think young people don't take anything seriously. Actually, millennials do take work very seriously. So then we finally have Samantha, right? Gen Z, say, just say mid-20s and younger. She's at the point where she's into just skill building. It's early enough in her career that she just wants to get the basics kind of done and build some competencies so she could do well in the workplace. And so anyway, this is just, kind of an example of the four generations and how they might be looking at each other based on their values and based on what their biases might be. Now, speaking of the workplace, millennials have become the largest generation in their labor force as of 2016. They surpassed the boomers and they surpassed Generation X. So what does this have to do with values and bias? Well, actually a lot. Typically when the predominant, where the largest generation kind of comes into the workplace, that's when things start to change. That's when you see a lot of change right now in the workplace. Of course, COVID has changed everything. But there's been some generation change as well. And the values of the millennials are starting to actually get noticed and get prioritized in the workplace. And what are the values of the millennials? Well, I think the Gallup organization CEO had put this together and I really resonated with it, but this is kind of the values and the things that are focused on, or were focused on in the past versus the future. It used to be that getting a paycheck was very important. Now, getting a paycheck is always important. People still want that. But we know that millennials and Gen Z are really focused on purpose as well. We know that satisfaction was a key element of satisfaction at work. But for the younger generations, they're looking for more than that. They're actually looking for some form of development. So it's not just like I'm happy at my job, but I'm actually learning and growing in my job and attaching myself to kind of a purpose. The old days of command and control boss and subordinate is ended with younger generations. They are looking for a coach. I mean, you have the U.S. military actually completely revamping their, the recruitment strategy with younger people now, and it's all about their development and the supervisors as in a more of a coaching role. Annual reviews are great, but really what younger generations are looking for is an ongoing conversation. And finally, it's not just about a job, it's about your life. Now, I know in your work, your job is literally your life. So you're right there, right? It is more than a job, it is life. But you could start to see that there are changes that are taking place in the workplace, and we get stuck in our kind of with our own lenses, the way we see things, and the generation that we are, and we oftentimes become biased. I don't like to do any presentation without quoting Aristotle. And this is a wonderful quote and really underscores the significance of generations and everything that we do. Generations are shaped by history, and then history is shaped by generations, right? So you come of age based on the historical events that are going on, and then you get older and you influence those, and you bring yourself and your biases along with that. So we're going to take a little break and end this module, but we want you to think about a couple things before we get to the next module. Have you experienced implicit bias, either generationally or otherwise, right? And number two is, has it affected you in any way? So spend a little time thinking about that, and we'll circle back and see you at the next module.